actually flipped the coin because it was clear who will be the first one and the second team. But actually last time we had this problem because none of us wanted to defend the side that we are defending today. Because I mean, IT is about India and India is about IT, right? So there is no doubt about that. Well, actually this is not the fact. And we were as convinced as were you just before we did our research. Because what research has showed is that IT is not really the engine of growth for India. You know, we have some experts in the topic, which include myself, Prachana, Steve, Andrew, and Barbara. And they will give you some really important facts about IT in India, just to understand that this is really not the fact. So let's start with the definition. Because we're speaking about growth here, so first we have to define what do we mean by growth, right? So the other team was showing a lot of information regarding the GDP growth percentages, whatever. But the point here is that our understanding of growth is much larger than just GDP. Because by growth, and here's a nice definition, we mean the growth of the society. I mean, if the society does not really grow, there is not a relevant growth for a country. But first of all, because I see some doubts in the other team, so of course we'll start with the GDP percentages. We cannot avoid that. So John will have more about that.
Thank you, Mint. Let's talk about IT's contribution to GDP. As you can see, IT contributes 4.5% to GDP. A sector that contributes this small number, is really insignificant. So if a sector contributes such insignificantly to GDP, it cannot be called an engine of growth. Here, let's compare the GDP of India and IT output. We see that India has seen a steep GDP growth in the past several years. But we see that even though we see a little bump in the IT sector here, it's pretty much a flat line. So there has to be something else that's giving India this steep growth. So any sector that's giving India this growth would be the engine of growth, and that's clearly not IT. Now let's talk about IT's contribution to employment. India has a total labor force of 459 million people. Of that, only 2.5% work in the IT sector, which makes up 0.5% in the 0.5% of the total labor force. So again, IT's contribution to employment is very small. Thus, it cannot be considered an engine of growth. Now let's talk about who can benefit from IT, or rather who do not benefit from IT. 70% of the unemployed people live in the rural areas. But all their IT jobs are centered in big cities, like our opponents mentioned, in big cities like Bangalore, Chennai, Bombay, Delhi. So these people clearly are not benefiting from IT sector. The other fact, 70% of labor is illiterate. And of the 30% that are literate, they might not be able to use computers. So again, we see that major part of the labor force is not benefiting from IT. Thank you.
Thank you, Archana. The other point I want to bring up is that the IT industry does not help the issue of poverty in India. 75% of India's population of 1.2 billion is currently living on less than $2 a day. Furthermore, of all the people in the world living on less than $1 a day, 1/3 are in India. India is often compared with countries such as Brazil and China. This is because they are all emerging and developing markets with large populations. So we decided to compare internet users as a percent of population. In China, the internet users account for 30% of the population, where in Brazil it's 40%. But in India, the internet users account for only 5% of the total population. This is something to think about. The other point I want to draw upon is that the IT sector does not help employment. Currently, up to 92% of India's labor force of 459 million is being absorbed in the informal, unorganized sector. So I don't think it comes as a surprise that India has 15 times more phone subscribers than it does taxpayers. Another point is that only a quarter of job applicants are typically considered employable. This is related to the fact that only 15% of Indian students reach high school and only 5% receive college education. And India's labor force right now is growing at 2% a year, with an unemployment rate of over 10%. So what this means is that the employment needs of the masses are not likely to be met by the IT industry. Also, it is evidence that India's development strategy is not resulting in broad-based and sustainable growth. Lastly, I want to point out that high-skilled labor, such as with the IT industry, has little, if any, trickle-down effects. To talk about the challenges that the IT industry is facing, Steve.
The Indian IT industry is really facing a number of threats currently. IT jobs, by their very nature, are very fluid. They can move around from country to country because they're technology-based. So once contracts are up, companies can move those jobs out of India to other competitors. Now, Raymond talked about they're getting around to improving the infrastructure. I saw this nice table. It definitely showed that power consumption has increased, but it hasn't shown any real increase in the capacity to produce power. In fact, a number of these IT centers have to run on diesel generators that are very expensive because they have frequent power outages. The roads in India are very poor, and we saw their wonderful gated communities. Well, they're gated because many of these cities are unsafe. In fact, 20% of the labor costs involved in doing business in India has to do with transporting employees from their safe gated communities to their safe workspaces. Now, 60% of IT grads from India actually leave for jobs abroad. They're also facing the challenge of near-sourcing. We saw a little bit of that in the Ireland case where companies are moving to outsource their jobs to countries that are closer geographically, linguistically, culturally. We see Bucharest, Romania, where wages are actually lower than many of the IT employees in India. They're really growing quite quickly in Romania there. We have companies like IBM, Oracle, and HP moving a lot of their jobs to Bucharest. German companies, because India can't address the German-speaking needs, are moving many jobs to Hungary or the Czech Republic. Even in the U.S., a lot of jobs are moving to Mexico, where Guadalajara has seen a very big investment in IT technology and IT education. Now, Indian IT is already losing jobs. Malaysia and the Philippines have passed India in call center jobs, and they're looking to move up the value-added chain to take on Indian IT jobs. Because of this increase in competition, many of the Indian IT laborers are moving into other industries. They're doing paralegal work, they're doing accounting services. And in fact, to stay price competitive, many of the IT companies are actually outsourcing their own job. Now, Wipro, which is the third largest IT company in India, their CEO came out and said that by the end of 2012, he anticipates that 50% of their workforce will actually not be Indian. There'll be other employees working in other countries. So you have to ask, if GDP is really increasing from the IT sector, who is receiving the GDP when all the jobs are going elsewhere? Here to talk about alternatives is Barbara.
Thank you, Steve. Now, we say that IT sector is the engine of Indian growth, but we think that India focuses too much on IT sector, and actually they've already ignored the importance of developing other sectors, such as industry sector. Why do we say so? Because, there is a very big problem of high unemployment rate in India. And for such a big population country like that, we can't afford a high unemployment rate. We have data from 2001 to 2009. IT sector has an average increase of 75,000 people working directly or indirectly in IT sector. But we also have the data, as Andrew pointed out, the annual labor force increases at a rate of 2%, which means we do the calculation and we found out that IT sector can only generate jobs for 0.9% of increased labor force, which is too small increase their high unemployment rate by increasing the percentage of the GDP in industry sector. And we chose these countries: China, Thailand, South Korea, and Indonesia, and also the average of South Asia. We don't want our data to be biased. And we found out these countries all experienced a dramatic increase in industry sector, whereas India made the smallest increase in industry sector. So by our logic, let's look at what happened to their unemployment rate. We see that despite all the other countries experienced a decreasing trend of unemployment rate, we found out India turns out to increases in unemployment rate. So the issues we stressed here has already drawn India's government's attention. So in 2005, Indian government decided to open some certain industries to FDI, where they used to allow domestic capital to invest only. These are refining, oil and gas refining, mining, and also construction businesses. These are all in industry. And we followed the research in 2008. There's a very big rebound in Indian industry, so which can partly explain why there is a very slight fall down of the unemployment rate in 2008 for India. And now we have Steve to summarize all the points we have.
Well, now you might be asking if, increasing the manufacturing sector has created so many more jobs, why is that not happening more? Well, that's because, unlike IT, many of the other industries are hampered from growth by the government regulation. Agriculture, for instance, they're the second largest wheat producer in the world, but the government has banned all wheat exports, despite the fact that they have 65 billion tons sitting in storage rotting. Now, the other team had mentioned that, that it is a great country to invest in, and they will protect your investment. However, the World Bank has ranked India worse than Asia in terms of starting a business, dealing with licenses, paying taxes, and enforcing contracts. Now what that really means is that if this gentleman here with the car, if he wanted to go out and he wanted to start a business, it would take him, on average, 270 days to license and register his business. And it would cost him in fees more than 7 times the average annual income of India. Now, if he was somehow able to go through all that and get a license to have a business, and he wanted to, say, open a store and hire some other Indians, well then, he would have to get a loan. Well, 70% of the banks are owned by the government of India, and they only give business loans to those companies that are in select sectors such as IT. So we see that other industries really suffer from the government control, but not IT. Despite the fact that there are so many controls on other industries, we see companies like Siemens, LG, and Ford, they're still going into these countries, and they're investing and they're creating manufacturing. Now what that really shows is that there is a demand for the Indian labor, there is a demand for Indian products, but the government regulation is stopping that from happening. So what we can conclude is that IT is not the engine for growth. The IT industry is too small to be such an engine, it's already losing jobs, and the IT really only benefits those educated rich elites. Now we really believe that the feasible alternative is to focus on labor-intensive industries and